In this video, we're going to cover 5 fundamental facts about bishops. First of all, bishop placement is crucial. Putting your bishop on the right square is very important. Secondly, there's a difference between a good bishop and a bad bishop. What is that difference? How do we tell the difference? Third, some positions are good for bishops and some positions not so good. We'll look at those differences. Fourth, we're going to talk about a bishop against a knight. When does a bishop dominate a knight? Little spoiler alert, a bishop can pin a knight, but a knight can't pin a bishop. And finally, we'll talk about when is a bishop just not enough to get the job done. So first, we're talking about bishop placement. And here in this opening plan, we see that black is going to develop this kingside bishop. And where to? Well, just one square out, because from here it has scope or room to move on both sides of the board. And so white copies that idea and does the exact same thing underneath the pawn chain. The bishop aims underneath the pawn chain. It's very powerful there. In this middle game position, we see the white bishop jump from a place where it's not doing very much at all, guarding one diagonal, to here where it guards the long diagonal, continues to cover those squares, guards backwards, and also protects that critical g-pawn as well. And we see that a bishop can be very good against charging pawns. And this pawn chain, 3 pawns coming down, if we put the bishop on a4, well, that's not going to work. Our opponent plays d3 and then c2, and we lose. So instead, the bishop jumps in front and guards the progress of all of those pawns. None of them can safely move forward. Now we see a bishop can sometimes be a bad bishop. In those previous examples, the bishop had plenty of scope, plenty of room to move. Here, this poor black bishop is trapped by its own pawns, and it can't get out. That's what we call a bad bishop. In this game, played between my 2 students, white had to make 2 important bishop decisions. Let's look at the first one. Black blocks to check with the bishop, and white has to decide, should I trade bishops, yes or no? He made the right choice. He traded bishops. And the reason that this is the right choice is because this is a bad bishop. White's bishop on b5 is bad because it's blocked by its own center pawns. So if we focus on this bishop and think about, wow, moving it back, it wouldn't be very helpful because your own center pawns block it from aiming towards black's king side. On the other hand, black's bishop has scope on both sides of the board. It's on the light squares, and black's center pawns are on the dark squares. So for black, it's the bishop on f8, the dark squared bishop, that is the bad bishop. So white makes the trade, and a couple moves later brings the bishop out here to attack the rook. And black should offer a trade of bishops, trying to get rid of his bad bishop. Instead, he blocks with a pawn, and white has a choice. He could retreat over here to h4, but he realizes he would have very bad scope, just one square to move to, and that wouldn't help out very much at all. So instead, white retreats correctly underneath this pawn chain and aims deep into the queen side. Now, if you do have a bad bishop, don't just go cry and resign. Instead, try to do something about it. Maybe trade it off or get it in the action. Here, black's bishop on c8 is a bad bishop. It's blocked by its own center pawns. But watch what black does. This game was played in 1910, and Levenfish is playing black. He maneuvers this bishop against Zanosko-Borovsky and gets it to a great square. So if you have a bad bishop, don't despair. Instead, give it some air. Now, bishops also love endgames with pawns on both sides of the board, because the bishop can quickly get back and forth from one side to the other. Here we see Bobby Fischer's bishop run circles, well, diagonals, around Mark Taimanov's knight. And it's pressuring that g-pawn, checking the king again, another check, and the bishop continues to exert pressure on weak pawns, get on critical diagonals, and eventually Bobby Fischer gives up the bishop at just the right moment. And we see another big difference between knights and bishops, that if black had a bishop, it would probably be able to stop white's pawns from being able to charge in on the queen side. But with a knight, it's too far away. The knight's a slow piece and takes a long time to come back over to the other side of the board, and Bobby Fischer won the game. Another Fischer game against Mikhail Tal back in 1962, and Fischer has gone to an endgame. Even though he's losing by a pawn, he has a bishop against a knight. And watch how, after this move, his bishop dominates the board. It attacks the knight, behind it is the pawn, it guards a critical square so the black king can't come up, and another critical square so that the rook can't get into a better position. That bishop against a knight was enough for Fischer to win the game. Now, how does a bishop beat a knight? Well, one way is to trap it. Here the black knight is on the side of the board, and the bishop moves into e3. The next move will be king g4, and then king takes knight. But a bishop can also pin a knight. Here the bishop comes out, pins the knight to the queen. A bishop can pin a knight can't pin a bishop. And in the endgame, you do want to find ways to restrict your opponent's knight. Here the bishop moves to a square where it guards a lot of the knight's favorite squares. So now the knight can't maneuver around, and he's going to be stuck over on the king side instead. And finally, when is a bishop simply not enough? At the end of a game, you can checkmate your opponent if you have a king and a queen, if you have a king and a rook. But you can't checkmate your opponent if you have just a king and a knight, or just a king and a bishop. It's insufficient. So, in this position, white has only a bishop. He knows he's not going to win, but black still has a chance to promote that pawn to a queen. White knows what to do. Bishop takes pawn, and after the king captures back, the game's over. This is a draw by insufficient material. All right, that's it for 5 fundamental facts about the bishop. Please join me in the progressive level of bishops. I'll check you later.